Okay, I think I'm going to start because the sooner I start, the sooner it finishes, and then drinks. So, I'm Andrew Solomon, as it says, at Geek Uni, and I'm going to tell you all about everything I know about APIs, SDKs, not as much as I know about Perl, but that's, you guys know that already. So first, to put this in context, why am I talking about APIs and SDKs? So, as I said, I have Geek Uni, which is one of my jobs, which is running this online training service. And most of my customers are companies which have people that they hire, and as part of the onboarding process, they need to learn Perl. And they use my online training services for that. And they even pay me for that, which is very nice. And it's a very straightforward interaction. We meet in some dark alleyway and there's an exchange of suitcases. Not quite, but it is simple, right? I do wish, because unfortunately it's not like that for the individuals that use my service. These people have to pull out a credit card. So they pull out their credit card and they type in a number, and there's some magic that takes place, and that winds up in my bank account. Now, what does that entail? And I managed to find this site here. Barclaycard isn't what I'm using for this service, but as you can see, there are 10 steps involved. So first of all, that's me, that's my site. And this is a little plugin to the page where they enter their credit card details. And that plugin talks to, in this case, Barclaycard, but we call the payment service provider, who then talks to Visa, or whoever's card it is that the person is using, who then talks to the bank. The bank goes, yeah, okay, you can have the money. It goes to Visa, they take a bit, and then the payment service provider takes a bit more, and then it goes back to the site, and I get this confirmation that Fred will pay, and I let them in. Not the easiest, most straightforward thing, and so that is payment service provision, which you're talking about. Now, unfortunately, these things, where's the presentation there? Sorry. That's better. These payment service provision companies are now being put under more serious legislation in the EU. And the EU is big enough that this is taking place across the globe. It's just started over the last few weeks, and it's going to be a while before it kicks in. But basically, if someone uses their credit card online, there are going to be a few more steps of confirmation that they really want to spend their money with your online service. Particularly if it's something like a subscription, because they might buy it and then forget in a few months that they're paying for it, and then until their grave, they're paying you every month. And so it's good. It's good that the rules are changed. But that is affecting all these payment service providers. PayPal is probably the most famous one, but Stripe is the one I use. WorldPay has been around for a while. What does that mean? So what it means is that when the EU's rules come into place, then the API, the service of my computer talking to their computer, has to change, because they're now different processes where a customer is confirming, double confirming, and so on. And the software development kit, SDK, that I'm using to talk to their service, therefore has to change. And also the user stories of people coming to my site will need to adapt as well. This is the focus of this talk. The reason I'm talking about it is because I think it's actually the hardest bit. And it's even harder because I've been maintaining a module on CPAN, Stripe, which a number of companies use for their interaction with the Stripe payment service provision. So this is the main question. When the service provider changes their API, which they will, how do we change the software development kits with the least amount of work? First of all, what's an API? Application Programming Interface. That's the stuff at the server side which determines the language with which the server talks to my computer. REST is the sort that we use these days. Try to forget SOAP. Has anyone used SOAP? Hands up if you've used SOAP. Poor things. I suspect some of you are still using SOAP, judging by the responses I got, but it's got to be done. But it's similar. I'm not going to show you any SOAP today because that's not the problem we're addressing here. But because it's an API, when you make a request, you're getting JSON or XML or something back. You're not getting HTML. It's for the computer to read. And the JSON comes to my computer and it has to understand what it said. Did they give us the money or did they not? Software development kit. That is the code on my machine which takes the JSON, or rather first makes the REST request and then gets the JSON response and makes sense of it. Now, this is what you do if you don't have an SDK. You just make a raw request. So this is the example REST service. I do a curl to that with back quotes. I don't, but just imagine. You take the response, just a bulk of text. You say, okay, I assume this is JSON. I decode it and turn it into a hash ref, a Perl data structure. And then I say, if it's got what I'm expecting, I'm happy, and I head out and start providing the service. If $@ if things die somewhere along the way, then we try and work through the JSON, or maybe it wasn't even JSON, maybe it was that bad, and try and diagnose what went wrong. It's a lot of fun. And if you do that every time that you have an interaction with the payment service provider, it's going to slow you down. So what we have instead is a software development kit for many REST services or APIs. So that's the Perl package, which I run on my box, which does all the transformation between JSON and Perl data structures, and it catches the errors. And if it's an error, it's got a nice handle on a nice parameter on the object it gives you back. It says yes, it was successful, or no, it wasn't a successful request. That's what you want from SDKs. So things are changing, APIs changing, need a new SDK. Great, I get it from the service provider. And because I'm generalizing this talk, I'm not just talking about payment service providers. I decided, okay, Andrew, find the biggest companies that have an online API presence. Now, that's a hardly well-defined question, but every question has an answer on Wikipedia. So I found Wikipedia's answer to this, and I got all these companies, from Amazon down to Rakuten, which I'd never heard of. But apparently these are the 10 biggest internet ISP providing companies. No question that Amazon is the top one, right? So I said, okay, I'll get my API, my SDK from the company. And I thought, well, I'm not using Java, but I can understand why each one of them's got a Java API. It's an old language. It's been around for a while. Python is hip for Google reasons. Node.js, yeah, I'd like to use that, but my code isn't Node.js. It's actually Perl. And if you can't see that at a distance, that's the number 0. none of these 10 biggest ISP providing companies has a Perl SDK which they maintain. I'm not saying that there aren't open source SDKs on CPAN, but I'm just saying that these companies who are providing the API aren't maintaining a Perl SDK to use it. Don't take it personally, okay? Swift and Ruby aren't much ahead of us, but yeah, Perl is a stinging zero. So I thought, hang on, what happens if I change Perl in that last column to OpenAPI? And you can't see that, can you? Oops. The number at the bottom there is 5. I don't know why that has fallen off the screen. But yeah, there are 5 of these companies which have OpenAPI. Now, you might probably ask me, what's OpenAPI? I'll come to that. But then once you've got OpenAPI, and if you have an established method for turning OpenAPI into a Perl SDK, you're sorted, right? But first of all, what is OpenAPI? Has anyone ever heard of OpenAPI? Oh, good. So this is my interpretation, and people can correct me as I go, because I'm definitely a beginner on this, and that's why I'm talking about it. So OpenAPI, it's JSON or YAML document or something, which says, more or less, exactly what the API does. It is still just written by humans, and it's written in JSON or YAML or something so that software can parse it. It's not software, though. But from this API, in principle, you have the specs which define the behavior of an SDK, the software development kit. So starting at so Swagger is the name of OpenAPI before it was called OpenAPI. And here's a nice example of, a simple example of an OpenAPI spec. You can click on that link if you want to, but it's just a whole lot of JSON. It would take a long time to read. But there's this nice package from CPAN, OpenAPI client. You give it the URL of the OpenAPI spec, and suddenly, ta-da, client is an SDK object, okay? And then you can say, well, so I'm looking at a pet store. I want to see the inventory of the pet store, i.e. what's on the shelf, and I just do this call. It's so pretty. I just did a nice call on this parameter of the object to get the result, and the output is 2 dogs and 3 cats. So I feel happy. That's so nice and simple and clean, and I did no code. All I did is I stuck that URL into that CPAN package. So my next step is, right, I'll just copy those lines and stick the Stripe OpenAPI spec in. But there were some problems, unfortunately. That's what makes this talk interesting. Stripe is maintaining, so OpenAPI as a specification language has versions, it's up to version 3. Stripe is only doing maintenance, not enhancements or new features for their V2 OpenAPI spec. They're only maintaining the OpenAPI 3 spec. So there's a problem because the OpenAPI client that I found on CPAN only does version 2 of OpenAPI, and their authors haven't responded on whether they're thinking of moving forward. Next problem. OpenAPI client is not complete to the extent that you got specs and it says you send me these fields in your request and I give you back these in response, but it doesn't determine exactly what form the request takes. So I know the names of the fields, but it turns out that the provider's spec, in this case Stripe, didn't take JSON, all right, which is the default for this client, it takes a funny post with all the parameters in the header. And it therefore takes extra work, fiddling, hacking around this OpenAPI client to get it to do the right request. Finally, if I take you back to this code here, where was it? There. This response, pretty though it is, it's not really an object. It's just a raw hash. So it hasn't done a great deal of interpretation based on the OpenAPI spec and the response to give you a nice, useful object. If things are complex, then you have to parse this hash. So it wasn't as simple as a one-liner as I'd hoped. So I asked the expert, who in my mind is Jose, who looks after pause, which was discussed in the last lecture, and also Kubernetes REST, which I haven't used. But basically, these are two online services which are constantly evolving, constantly being updated, and he has managed to put together a methodology for keeping the SDKs up to date. So I interrogated him, and I said, what's the magic? And I'm saying that this is my interpretation of what he said. So supposing, back into the abstract, there's this foobar API that you want to use. First of all, use Swagger Schema, which is one of his modules, to parse the OpenAPI spec. So that big JSON file which says exactly how this API works, you parse it using that. Now you've got a Perl object from which you can not call the service, no, you can use that object to generate Perl code. That's what he's doing. So having parsed the OpenAPI spec, he then has written some code which takes what comes out of the spec and turns it into Perl code. And then, using Template Toolkit, you got a Perl library with the click of a button. And then it goes up to CPAN. Now, I confess I haven't done this myself. He claims it's very maintainable, and I trust what he's saying. He didn't explain this in terms of work hours, but it seems to be going well. So what I came to conclude from that was, that I didn't manage to work out what I've come to conclude from it, except that there is a nice, clean way of doing it. It looks like a lot of work. It's being used. I would like to see things progress beyond that, because I've got a feeling that it's only large APIs, I mean, with a large client base in the Perl community, which will have the energy to keep these things going. But I hope that we move beyond that, and it does become just a single one-liner, as we saw in that first example. So that's it. Any questions?
Okay, so in your code you have imported pets to Swagger file, and then you run get inventory method.
Yeah.
The get inventory method, where is it part of the CPAN OpenAPI library, or it does come from?
So that method was generated when it saw that name in the OpenAPI spec. So that's what's so pretty, right? That method never existed until the module which I installed read the specs and said, okay, I've got to create this object which has this method. So it is very cool. I think it looks really cool, and I wish that it would be more usable and maintainable, because to me that's the ideal. That's it. Thank you very much.